All right, welcome back everybody to another installment. Today what we're going to be going over is the topic of the election of 1896. So this is a little bit different topic than what we've been discussing about recently. I know we've talked a lot about the American Civil War. So today we're going to start to look at some different eras of American history and start to dive more into the political sphere surrounding U.S. history. But anyways, before we go ahead and get started, make sure that if you're not subscribed to the channel that you do so, and if you like this video, please like and comment below. Otherwise, enjoy this video. So today we're going to be talking about the election 1896, and this is often credited by many historians as well as political scientists as being one of the most influential presidential elections in U.S. history. Now, within my classes, there's two elections that I often give a sole lecture dedicated to, and this is one of them, the election of 1896, the election of 1800 being the other one, because it's so influential in shaping our modern understanding of presidential election cycles. And so today we're going to start to dive into all the facts and facets associated with the election of 1896, really digest the election itself, and start to see how it's become known as the first modern presidential election. We're going to take a look at both candidates, take a look at the really the two major political parties, and see what were their platforms, what were they arguing, why was this so important during 1896. To begin our discussion over the election in 1896, let's give a kind of brief description of what some of the origins of this election, what will ultimately become the key issue of this election. Now, the major issues that are going to come up within this particular presidential election are going to center around America's financial situation. Recently, in 1893, what we had seen is the United States had undergone what was their version of the Great Depression before the Great Depression. The Panic of 1893 saw over a quarter of Americans lose their jobs, and it especially harsh amongst farmers. And therefore, Americans coming up to the presidential election in 1896 were beginning to rethink their financial system. And specifically, they were starting to focus on the currency issue, whether or not they should have what's known as hard money, to where their US dollar was backed solely by gold, or if they should back soft money, to where they should start to introduce more and more silver to back the US dollar, and therefore create inflation, something that they could use to then combat deflation that had plagued much of the period. And therefore, this had been the key issue that had begun to take fold within Americans' minds by the presidential election of 1896. But before we can talk deeper about the currency issue within American society, especially with its role within the election of 1896 and what the two major political parties are going, or their stance are going to take in regards to this currency issue, let's first start to talk about the beginnings to the election of 1896. As we all know, with the modern presidential elections, the election cycle does not begin in November of that election year. It begins long before then, when we start to see both presidential candidates begin to vie for voters, so that way they can improve their chances of becoming the next president of the United States. And very similarly, we saw this develop within this presidential election. Now, what we're going to see is the ultimate Republican nominee, that of William McKinley. What we're going to see is he's going to begin his presidential, or his bid for the presidency, in the second half of 1895. At this time, William McKinley was the governor of Ohio, and he had long served within the U.S. House of Representatives, and even at one point had been Speaker of the House. And he had helped author several bills and laws that had been pushed through Congress. So he already had developed a strong presidential resume. However, he had to campaign early if he was to ensure that he'd become the Republican nominee in the upcoming election of 1896, because one thing to understand about presidential politics back in the 1890s and during the Gilded Age is that ultimately, in order for William McKinley to become the presidential nominee, he would probably have to win the favor of many party bosses. Now, the party bosses were essentially members of either the Republican or the Democratic Party who led their respected party within their respective state. So let's say if you were in New York, the party boss was that of Thomas Platt, and therefore he would dominate New York politics. So if you were hoping to get any sort of delegates or backing from the Republican Party in New York, William McKinley had to win over his favor. However, there was one issue with this. William McKinley, he did not want to buy their votes. Now, what we had seen throughout the Gilded Age is that when a candidate, whether they were part of the Republican or Democratic Party, in order to gain delegates to vote for them at their respective national conventions, is that they went through these party bosses and promised that they would give either the party bosses or other members of their respective party rings jobs within their administration if they're elected. And therefore, by offering these jobs, they would give them their support and their backing during the upcoming presidential election cycle. However, this was something that McKinley did not want to do. And therefore, he, coupled with his campaign manager, Mark Hanna, had to construct a new, entirely different campaign in order to undermine the party bosses and ultimately win the Republican nomination. So how do they do this? What we're going to see is that William McKinley is going to do something that Republicans had long forgotten about, especially since the days of Reconstruction. Now, one thing to recognize about gaining your respective party's nomination is you need the necessary delegates at your national convention to vote for you. And therefore, if you're going to try to undermine the party bosses, you should probably focus on states where they're often neglected by your respected party. And therefore, you could easily undermine these major party bosses in, say, the states of New York as well as Pennsylvania. Therefore, William McKinley is going to begin his campaigning within the South. Now, when we think about the South during this period, we often think of it as a stronghold of the Democratic Party. We had not seen any of these southern states vote Republican since the Reconstruction period. However, one thing to recognize, there are still a lot of delegates in the South from the Republican Party. They make up roughly about half of the delegates that would represent the Republican Party at the Republican National Convention. And therefore, if you garner their support, you would almost ensure that you would become the Republican nominee for the presidency. And this is exactly what William McKinley as well as Mark Hanna will do. Mark Hanna will purchase a property within Georgia, and they're going to begin to meet with many Southern delegates to try to swing over their favor. How they're going to do this is they're essentially going to state that they're going to push forth some of their policies and ultimately back some of the bills that they were wanting to push through Congress. Try to back some of their agenda. And effectively, what we're going to see is William McKinley, by the end of 1895 and moving into 1896, is going to win over much of the South's Republican delegates. And therefore, he's going to essentially find the party bosses with their pants down. He already has garnered over half of the delegates for Republican convention to gain the nomination. And he only needs to get a handful within the North. But nonetheless, what we're going to see is he's going to continue to campaign in the North. And therefore, once we get to June of 1896, we're going to see that he's easily going to become the Republican nominee for the presidency. So that's kind of his background in the build up to the election of 1896. Now let's turn our attention to the other side of the political aisle. What are the Democrats doing? Well, the Democrats are essentially divided. Remember, earlier I talked about the currency issue, and what we'd seen is the Democratic Party was very much divided on whether or not they should have a U.S. dollar backed by gold, something that was promoted by President Grover Cleveland, or if they should embrace this idea of free silver to where they should allow this unlimited coinage of silver so they could create inflation and hopefully relieve the plights of many of those farmers as well as those within the working class. However, since they were divided, this meant that they did not have a strong candidate who they wanted to push forth for the presidency come the election of 1896. And therefore, what we're going to see is that by the Democratic National Convention in July of 1896, the Democrats don't have a clear nominee. It wasn't clear who would run on their ticket, and even the Republicans, once they've nominated William McKinley, believed it would just be easy work of overthrowing the Democratic regime. Remember, Grover Cleveland was in office when we see the inauguration of the Panic of 1893, and essentially by this point, the Democrats had become associated with the Panic of 1893. And when you're in time of financial crisis as Americans, odds are you're probably going to vote for the other political party. So that way, hopefully, their method would ultimately work. And as a result, what we're going to see is when the Democrats meet at the Democratic National Convention in July of 1896, they're then going to begin to try to distance themselves from Grover Cleveland. There will be that faction of delegates who are going to support Grover Cleveland. However, about two-thirds of the delegates at the Democratic National Convention are going to try to distance themselves. These are going to be more the free silver Democrats who want to promote this idea of at least the coinage of silver backing the U.S. dollar, if not the unlimited coinage of silver. But anyways, like I said, there's not going to be one real candidate that's going to represent them. And therefore, this is going to make conditions ripe for a dark horse candidate. And ultimately, what we're going to see is after a series of events that occurs over several weeks at the Democratic National Convention, we'll finally see that one William Jennings Bryan is ultimately going to find himself as a Democratic nominee. And how does he find himself as a Democratic nominee? Well, it's largely credited with his famous Cross of Gold speech. And I will read a short excerpt from that speech right here to kind of demonstrate the emotion that was put into the speech and how it's ultimately going to galvanize the support of much of the Democratic Party. If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost, having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere. We will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. As I mentioned, this speech is going to galvanize the Democratic National Convention. What we're going to see is after a few brief moments of silence, it's going to erupt in an applause. They're going to be a chanting, Bryan, Bryan, wanting immediately for William Jennings Bryan to become their nominee. However, William Jennings Bryan is going to reject having a vote that very day. He's going to state that if this fervor is going to live on, then they can wait to the next day to vote him to become the Democratic nominee. And this is exactly what's going to happen. Therefore, it propels, almost like a lightning rod, William Jennings Bryan to the Democratic nomination. And with it, he's also going to galvanize a great deal of support amongst the American public for the upcoming election. Once Bryan has secured the Democratic nomination for the presidency, now it's time to embark upon the campaign that would lead up to election night on November 3rd, 1896. And what we're going to see is that both candidates are going to take two completely different campaign styles. What we're going to see is that William Jennings Bryan is going to conduct a speaking tour where he would go across the many states of the nation. He'd actually become the first president in U.S. history to traverse across the nation and actually speak directly to the American people to try to garner their support. What we'll ultimately see is over the course of the next few months is he'll deliver over 500 speeches in numerous states across the Union. In contrast, what we're going to see is William McKinley is going to really, I would say, pioneer a new style of campaigning. He's going to conduct what's known as a front porch campaign. Now, front porch campaign, as you could already tell from its title, is essentially he's going to be doing all of his campaigning from his front porch. Rather than going out to the masses to deliver speeches, he's going to have the masses come to them. And this is going to benefit him within this upcoming election. Now, the reason it's going to benefit him is because it's going to enable him to deliver speeches to particular groups. So we'll see that as he was going along the campaign cycle, we'll start to see that there'll be groups of African-American activists from the South that would come to his home in Canton, Ohio. We'd also see groups of ex-Confederate veterans, as well as bicycle clubs, as well as Catholics. And why this is going to be very beneficial for his campaign is because it's going to enable him to prepare speeches that could target those specific groups. For example, in regards to the bicyclist, what we're going to see is he'd be able to deliver a speech to where he would say he would promote policies that would help back their agenda. And effectively, this is going to be something new, especially in this era of politics, because never before we'd seen presidents deviate from their party's policies to try to target specific groups. Largely, they were trying to garner the support of full-fledged Republican Party members. However, this time what we're seeing is William McKinley is actually appealing to different groups, stating that I'm going to promote policies that are going to promote your groups. We'll even see that he'll begin to issue campaign buttons to these various groups to garner their support. And actively, we'll see that ex-Confederate veterans, these bicyclists, as well as other groups, would actively campaign on his behalf throughout this election cycle. As we started to see William McKinley begin to gain steam with his front porch campaign, we still see that William Jennings Bryan was actively campaigning across the United States. And this is where it's going to be play very much into William McKinley's favor. Now remember, with this Cross of Gold speech, we had seen that Bryan had galvanized the nation. He had invoked feelings amongst much of the Democratic delegates. And likewise, he had also stirred the emotions of the American people. However, quickly, as he began his campaign of going across the nation, addressing several different towns and several different states in a matter of short succession, he's quickly going to realize that this is very exhaustive. What we're going to start to see is that he'll begin to lose his voice very early on in the campaign. We'll often see that he'll make the joke at the end of many of his speeches, stating to his supporters that he was sorry he did not give a better speech, as he left his voice in the previous town. Effectively, what we're going to see is that with this exhaustive campaign style, it would play again into the favor of William McKinley, especially as we started to see campaigners go out on his behalf who would follow Bryan around the nation and begin to challenge his policies. Most notably, one of the campaigners that's going to try to thwart many of Bryan's arguments and following around the country is going to be that of a young Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, in the build-up to the Republican National Convention, he did not support William McKinley. He actually thought he'd be a weak leader within office, and very much so. McKinley was very suspicious to this young Republican, and therefore Theodore Roosevelt, after his candidate did not receive the Republican nomination, is then going to try to fall back into favor with the McKinley administration. He wants to one day hopefully get the administrative seat of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and therefore making a deal with several of McKinley's advisors, most notably that of Henry Cabot Lodge as well as Mark Hanna. We're then going to see that Theodore Roosevelt would actively campaign within the McKinley campaign in order to gain hopefully a seat within the upcoming administration. Now what we're going to see is he's going to doggedly follow William Jennings Bryan in the Michigan, through Michigan, as Bryan was giving many of his speeches. And what we're going to see is that Theodore Roosevelt's often going to counter many of the arguments of Bryan very doggedly. And effectively what we're going to see is he'll be very effective in promoting the McKinley campaign. However, as I mentioned, as we've started to see Bryan deliver all these speeches, in many cases he would deliver up to several speeches a day in several different towns. By the time we reach November of 1896, very much so, Bryan needs a vacation. We'll see that he'll return to his home in Nebraska. At the same time, we're going to see William McKinley would end his front porch campaign in Canton, Ohio, and they would await the results on the night of November 3rd, 1896, to see who would become the next president of the United States. And as we'll see, there's this electoral map that I've blown up here on the screen. We'll see that McKinley easily wins the election. And we'll see that he'll be the first presidential candidate since Ulysses S. Grant to garner a majority of the popular vote, and effectively propel himself to the White House, to where we'll see he'll inaugurate a new era of American history, leading and bridging America from the 19th century into the 20th century, both in regards to the progressive era as well as an era to where we see that the United States would emerge on the world stage. However, that's a subject for another video. But anyways, with that said, we'll go ahead and wrap up this topic over the election of 1896. If you like this video, please like the video below. Comment as well. Tell me your thoughts, maybe who you would have supported within this presidential election. And then also make sure that you subscribe if you have not done so to the channel already. Other than that, everybody, I'll see you next time.